Zeray, Book 5 of Shardik by Richard Adams. Read by Celeste Lawrence in April 2021. Across the Vrako, Chapter 39 of Shardik by Richard Adams. In Bekla he had heard of the country east of Kabin, the midden of the empire. One of his provincial governors had called it, a province with no estates and no government, without revenue and without one city. 40 miles below Artelga the Teltherna turned, in a great bend, to flow southward past the eastern extremity of the Gelt Mountains. South of these mountains, and west of the Teltherna, lay a remote wilderness of wooded ridges, of marshes, creeks, and forest, without roads, and with no settlements except a few miserable villages, where the inhabitants lived on fish, half-wild pigs, and whatever they could scratch from the soil. In such a region, to seek and find a man was all but impossible. Many a fugitive and criminal had disappeared into its wastes. There was a proverb in Bekla, "I would kill so-and-so were it worth the journey to Zeray." Rough, unruly boys would be told by their mothers, "You'll end in Zeray." It was rumoured that from this isolated place, for town it could not be called, where the Teltherna narrowed to a strait less than a quarter of a mile wide, a man who could pay might be taken across to the eastern shore, and no questions asked. In the old days, even the northern army of patrol had fixed the eastern limit of its march at Kabin, and no tax collectors or assessors would cross the Vrako for fear of their lives. Such was the country which Keldrek had now entered, and the place in which, by Elroth's mercy, he was free to remain alive for as long as he could. Having taken the fresh shoes from his pack and put them on, he walked fast for some while down the narrow overgrown track. What more likely, he thought, than that, once the gate and the ford were open, some might follow in the hope of overtaking and killing him? For although he knew well enough that he was likely to die in this country, and indeed could find in himself little desire to save his life, yet he was determined not to lose it at the hands of any Yeldashay or other enemy of Shardik. Within an hour he came to a place where an even wilder path branched northward to his left, and this he followed, clambering for a time through the undergrowth beside it to avoid leaving traces on the track itself. At last, a little before noon, having heard and seen no one since his crossing of the Vrako, he sat down by the bank of a creek, and, when he had eaten, fell to considering what he should do. Underlying all his thoughts, like a rock submerged in a swirling pool, was the conviction that he had passed some mysterious but none the less real spiritual boundary, over which he could never return. What was the meaning of the adventure at the Streels of Urta, the news of which the shepherds had heard with so much awe and fear? What had befallen him in his oblivion on the battlefield, while he lay at the mercy of the unavenged dead? And why had Elroth spared the life of one whose rule had brought about the loss of his own son? Pondering these inexplicable happenings, he knew that they had quenched the strength and faith that had burned in the heart of the priest-king of Bekla. Little more than a ghost he now felt himself to be, a drained thing, haunting a body wasted with hardship. Deepest bell of all that tolled in his heart was Elroth's news of Shardik. Shardik had crossed the Vrako and was believed to be dying. In that there could have been no deceit. And if he, Keldrek, still set any value on his life, his best course would be to accept it. In a country of this nature, to look for Shardik would be only to invite such danger and hardship as neither his mind nor his body were capable of withstanding. Either he would be murdered, or he would die in the forests of the hills. Shardik, whether alive or dead, was irrecoverable, and for the least chance of life he himself ought to head south, contrive somehow to make his way into northern Tranilda, and then reach the Ortelgan army. Yet, an hour later, he was once more climbing northwards, holding, with no attempt at concealment or self-protection, to the track as it wound into the lower hills. Elroth, he thought bitterly, had rated him accurately enough. Take my word for it, neither he nor the bear can harm us now. No, indeed, for he was the priest of Shardik, and nothing else beside. Afraid of Takaminian's contempt, and influenced by him to believe that the will of God could be none other than that Shardik should conquer Bekla, he had stood by while the Tuginda was bound and led away like a criminal, and had then gone on to set himself up as the mediator of Shardik's favour to his people. Without Shardik he would be nothing, a rainmaker mumbling in a drought, a magician whose spells had failed. to return to Zelda and Gedladan with the news, if they did not already know it, that Elroth was with the Eldashay, and Shardik lost forever, would be to sign his own death warrant. They would scarcely lose a day in getting rid of such a figure of defeat. Elroth knew this. Yet he knew more. He had understood, as many an enemy would not, Keldrek's passionate faith and the integrity of his belief in Shardik. As an experienced master, though privately entertaining contempt for a servant's personal values and beliefs, can nevertheless perceive that by his own lights the servant is capable of sincerity, even perhaps of courage and self-denial, so Elroth, hating Shardik, had known that Keldrek, whatever gleams of hope fortune might tempt him with, would be unable to separate his own fate from that of the bear. And this was why, since he also knew, or supposed that he knew, thought Keldrek, with a sudden spurt of forlorn defiance, that Shardik was dying, he had seen no harm in sparing this priest-king's life. But why had he actually gone about to impose his will in this matter upon those surrounding him? Could it be, Keldrek wondered, that he himself had become visibly marked with some sign, perceptible to such as Elroth, of being accursed, of having passed through merited sufferings to a final inviolability in which he was now to remain, to await the retribution of God? At this thought, shuffling slowly on through the solitude, he sighed and muttered under the burden of his misery, for all the world like some demented old woman in a desolated town, bearing in her arms the weight of a dead child. Even in this notorious no-man's land he had not expected so complete an emptiness. All day he met never a soul, heard no voice, saw no smoke. As afternoon turned to evening, he realized that he would be forced to pass the night without shelter. In the old days, as a hunter, he had sometimes spent nights in the forest, but seldom alone, and never without fire or weapons. To send him across the Vrako without even a knife, and with no means of making a fire, had this perhaps been intended after all as nothing but a cruel way of putting him to death? And Shardik, whom he would never find, was Shardik already dead? Sitting with his head in his hands, he passed into a kind of waking oblivion that was not sleep, but rather the exhaustion of a mind unable any longer to grip thought, slipping and sliding like wheels in the mud of the rains. When at last he lifted his head, he at once caught sight, among the bushes close by, of an object so familiar that although it had been carefully concealed, he felt surprised not to have noticed it earlier. It was a trap, a wooden blockful, such as he himself had often set in days gone by. It was baited with carrion and dried fruit, but these had not been touched, and the trip-peg was still supporting the block. The evening wanted no more than 2 hours to nightfall, and, as well he knew, those who leave traps unvisited overnight are apt to find the next day that scavenging beasts have reached them first. He scratched out his footprints with a broken branch, climbed a tree, and waited. In less than an hour he heard the sounds of someone approaching. The man who appeared was dark, thick-set, and shaggy-haired, dressed partly in skins and partly in old ragged garments. A knife and 2 or 3 arrows were stuck in his belt, and he was carrying a bow. He bent down, peered at the trap under the bushes, and was already turning away when Keldrek called to him. At this he started, drew his knife in a flash, and vanished into the undergrowth. Keldrek realized that if he were not to lose him altogether, he must take a risk. He scrambled to the ground, calling, "I beg you, don't go, I need help." "What do you want, then?" answered the man, invisible among the trees. "Shelter. Advice, too. I'm a fugitive, exile, whatever you like. I'm in trouble." "Who isn't? You're this side of the Vrako, aren't you?" "I'm unarmed. Look for yourself." He threw down the pack, raised his arms, and turned one way and the other. "Unarmed? Then you're mad." The man stepped out from the bushes and came up to him. He was indeed a ruffian of frightening appearance, swarthy and scowling, with a yellow mucus discharge of the eyes, and a scar from mouth to neck, which reminded Keldrek of Belcotrazet. "I'm in no state to play tricks or drive a bargain," said Keldrek. "This pack's full of food and nothing else. Take it and give me shelter for tonight." The man picked up the pack, opened and looked into it, tossed it back to Keldrek, and nodded. Then, turning, he set off in the direction from which he had come. After a time he said, "No one after you?" "Not since the Vrako." They walked on in silence. Keldrek was struck by the complete absence of that friendly curiosity which usually finds a place in strangers' meetings. If the man wondered who he was, whence he had come, and why, he evidently did not intend to ask, and there was that about him which made Keldrek think better of putting any questions on his own account. This, he realized, must be the nature of acquaintance in this country of shame for the past and hopelessness for the future, the courtesy of the prison and the madhouse. However, some kinds of question were apparently permissible, for after a time the man jerked out, "Thought what you're going to do?" "Not yet. Die, I dare say." The man looked sharply at him, and Keldrek realized that he had spoken amiss. Here men were like beasts at bay, defiant until they were torn to pieces. The whole country, like a brigand's cave, was divided into bullies and victims, the last place in which to speak of death, whether in jest or acceptance. Confused, and too weary to dissimulate, he said, "I was joking. I've got a purpose, though I dare say that to you it may seem a strange one. I'm looking for a bear that's believed to be in these parts. If I could find it—" He stopped, for the man, his mouth and jaw thrust forward, was staring at him from his oozing eyes, with a mixture of fear and rage, the rage of one who attacks whatever he does not understand. He said nothing, however, and after a moment Keldrek stammered, It's the truth. I'm not trying to make a fool of you." "Better not," answered the man. "So you're not alone, then?" "I've never been more alone in my life." The man drew his knife, seized him by the wrist, and forced him to his knees. Keldrek looked up into the snarling, violent face. "What's this about the bear, then? What you up to? What you know about the other one? The woman, eh?" "What other one? For God's sake, I don't know what you mean." "Don't know what I mean?" Panting, Keldrek shook his head, and after a moment the man released him. "Better come and see, then. Better come and see. You mind now, I don't take to tricks." They went on again, the man still clutching his knife, and Keldrek half-minded to run from him into the woods. Only his exhaustion held him back, for the man would probably pursue, overtake, and perhaps kill him. They crossed a ridge and descended steeply towards a dreary, stagnant creek. Smoke hung in the trees. A patch of ground along the shore, cleared after a fashion, was littered with bones, feathers, and other rubbish. At one side, too near the water, stood a lopsided, chimneyless hovel of poles, branches, and mud. There were clouds of flies. 3 or 4 skins were pegged out to dry, and some blackbirds, crows or rooks, were huddled in a wooden pen on the marshy ground. The place, like a song out of tune, seemed an offence against the world, for which the only possible remedy was obliteration. The man again grasped Keldrek's wrist, and half led, half dragged him towards the hut. A curtain of dusty skins hung across the entrance. The man jerked his head and gestured with his knife, but Keldrek, stupid with fatigue, fear, and disgust, did not understand that he was to enter first. The man, seizing his shoulder, pushed him so that he stumbled against the curtain. He pulled it aside, ducked his head, and went in. The walls surrounded a single evil-smelling place, at the further end of which a fire was smouldering. There was little light, for apart from the curtained door and a hole in the roof through which some of the smoke escaped, there was no opening. At the further end, however, he made out a human shape, wrapped in a cloak, and sitting back towards him on a rough bench beside the fire. As he peered, bending forward and flinching from the knife at his back, the figure rose and turned to face him. It was the Tuginda.